Our last presenter is Cassandra Selsor, and the title of the project is Beyond Books Behind Bars, Anti-Racist Practice in Activist Spaces. An ethnographic study of the intersections of whiteness and womanhood as it pertains to anti-racist activism and working class, Start again. An ethnographic study of the intersections of whiteness and womanhood as it pertains to anti-racist activism and working across racial lines. This project investigates how white racism is reproduced in heterogeneous activist spaces. It argues that because no one can stand outside racism, white people need to throw out the question of whether they can truly be anti-racist and see anti-racism as an ever-evolving process that demands emotional and intellectual work. Cassandra.
Hello, welcome to the last presentation of the day. Books Behind Bars, Anti-Racist Practice in Activist Spaces investigates how white women's racism is reproduced in heterogeneous activist spaces through an ethnography of the organization Books Behind Bars, which I am a part of. All aspects of this organization have been anonymized, including participants' names and the organization's name itself. Books Behind Bars addresses youth incarceration, slide forward, by providing uncensored access to books. Books are not supposed to be used as a reward or withheld as a punishment, but at every turn there are opportunities for prison staff and administration to censor patrons' choices. In this complicated space, a group of 11 people have joined together to do the work of educating the public about youth incarceration and fighting against censorship in the prison system. Because this group was founded by a powerful black woman activist who remains anonymous due to the anonymity of the group, anti-racism and prison abolition are central principles. However, there is not a consensus among steering committee members on the philosophy of the group. Books Behind Bars members have always been primarily white women. Currently, there are 7 white women on the steering committee and 4 women of color. In my work, I interviewed 2 women of color, Lauren and Mary, and 3 white women, Olivia, Tara, and Sabrina. All respondents agreed that Books Behind Bars is lacking representation on the steering committee from people of color, young people, and people affected by mass incarceration. The way Books Behind Bars frames itself publicly definitely has something to do with this. The website does not explicitly mention that the organization is anti-racist, and there's only one mention of our prison abolitionist stance in our videos. The website describes our mission in terms of literacy, access to information, and personal freedom for incarcerated youth, but does not address that primarily youth of color are incarcerated. Members of the steering committee may not use colorblind language in their personal discourse, but our media outlet definitely does. Not talking about race in our media promotes the idea that we are race blind, and thus informs who makes contact with us through steering committee applications and volunteerism. The fact that we are a prison abolitionist organization is generally mentioned to volunteers, but in such a way as to introduce them to the concept. Books Behind Bars steering committee members have gradually developed the idea that we are a Trojan horse for prison abolition. It is not clear whether this idea was sparked by the founding activists themselves, but it is prevalent in our discourse. White steering committee members also expressed their ability to use prison abolition as a gateway to anti-racism for both themselves and other white people that they want to educate, including volunteers that have shown interest. Still, there is the fact that prison abolitionist language itself runs the risk of becoming colorblind. While educating white people about anti-racism is an important task for white people, it is not clear that it aids incarcerated youth. Talking to other white people about prison abolition may be easier for white interviewees than talking about race. According to whiteness studies scholar Kristen Myers, white people engage differently when talking about race when people of color are absent from the discussion. Because there were no people of color to hold white people to a certain standard in Myers' study, white people are emboldened to act and speak in racist ways. For white steering committee members, the consequences are different. In homogenous groups, white participants may feel that they have more expertise and are able to educate their white peers, but their conversation may fall more along the lines of prison abolition versus anti-racism. This is a double-edged sword, because it is imperative that whites break our silence and educate other white people. Conversely, talking to white volunteers about abolition with the unstated implication that most of the youth we serve are of color reifies the discourse of white silence that white people have been enculturated in. Politically educating white people about prison abolition cannot be the only form of activism Books Behind Bars does. Focusing solely on this alienates people of color, the people most affected by youth incarceration. Creating a situation in which volunteer events consist of a room of mostly white people sets up a potentially discursively violent environment for volunteers and steering committee members of color. It can also reify white supremacy by playing into the myth of the white savior. According to communications scholar Nicole Mariatono, the white savior signals a heroic colonizing force responsible for civilizing primitive indigenous non-white peoples. Volunteers sometimes show evidence of this conflict. During our holiday card drive, we received cards for incarcerated youth from around the world. Despite our guidelines that prohibited advice giving and religious overtones, cards contained paternalistic messaging like, "Use this time to think about what you've done." They indicated both a desire to civilize and colonize youth of color through Christianity, and a paternalism that suggested the author's total lack of understanding of systems of oppression. It is true that we got many cards that were thoughtful and beautiful, and it is true that those who sent cards were not steering committee members or even in-person volunteers. But as people get further away from our organization, the message of anti-racism is certainly lost, as is the message of prison abolition. There are instances where being a Trojan horse makes sense. When dealing with prison administration, it is required that we be a Trojan horse so that we can preserve our relationships and our patrons' access to books. However, the Trojan horse philosophy tends to recreate white supremacy as we attract people who are not willing to learn about anti-racism and flagrantly ignore the boundaries put in place to prevent youth from receiving harmful racist messaging. Anyone can come to Books Behind Bars and learn, but there must be a desire to self-educate present in order for white people to utilize positive white racial identity development. White racial identity development, a term coined by research psychologist Janet Helms, is a model for how white people can develop an anti-racist consciousness by becoming aware of systems of oppression and their racial privilege. We are not explicit enough about our anti-racism and even our abolitionist views, but this is starting to change. Lauren is already connected to many anti-racist organizations in the city, and they've begun building partnerships with some of them this year. We have since become official supporters of youth activism against police violence and begun our own campaign to stop bills that criminalize youth of color. This ideological shift has the potential to change the face of the organization so that it is centered on youth of color and their families. Still, there is an uneasiness in talking about how our philosophy should change that is only recently being addressed. An unwillingness to talk about racism is still very present in the group setting, and while this is contextually understandable, it remains one of the most significant problems in the organization. This has a radiating effect on the organization and a burdening effect on steering committee members of color. Books Behind Bars' first priority should be to the communities it serves, low-income Black and brown communities that are most affected by youth incarceration, not to white people who may or may not show their support through donation or volunteerism. We cannot be apologists for other white people's mediocrity or enable their white savior fantasies, not because we are somehow better than them, but because this strategy does not create long-lasting ideological shifts. It is infinitely more important that we work in community with the communities we are attempting to serve so that we become a known resource. No matter how intersectional and anti-racist Books Behind Bars becomes, in both theory and practice, we will never be absolved of the history of racism. Anti-racist is not something someone becomes, but an active process that is lived every day. When white people ask ourselves, can we truly be anti-racist? It connotes that there is some level of good white personhood that one could achieve. This ultimately uses colorblind racism and white saviorism as underlying ideologies. Despite white people's best efforts, we are going to be racist because racism is mostly unconscious and predicated on a larger cultural system. White people need to throw out the entire question and make a solid commitment to doing work in community with people of color. While it is important to understand our values, we are dwelling too much on philosophy, which destroys our ability to engage in anti-racist practice. What really matters are the relationships we build with other people when we can see that our struggles are bound up together and that our fates intertwine. Thanks.